3, 2, 1, los.
Okay, welcome back everybody. Welcome to a new session of the lecture series Doing Diversity in Higher Education in the AURORA European University Alliance. Today we have a speaker from Innsbruck, which we will introduce later on. Before we start with Rina's paper, we will spend a few minutes looking back to last week, as we usually do. And last week we were introduced into the concept of a legal clinic, which was a very interesting concept to hear. A legal clinic was described as a place where students were introduced not only in legal questions, but also into the social setting of law. Basically asking the question, who has access to be represented in front of the law, and how does this representation work? A big role in this experimental learning, the human side, I think they described it, in this experimental learning were narratives. And we learned that narrating the client's story is a legal strategy as well as a therapeutic tool. So when you can tell your own story, you also learn to mediate your own position in society. And I thought it was very interesting to apply narratives as a kind of, maybe you could say, as a cultural tool in these legal settings. It was a talk by two colleagues from law, Francesca Scamarella and Flora Di Donato from the University of Naples. We move all across Europe in this lecture series. Today we're very close to home. And Dirk will now introduce the colleague from our very own university, from the University of Innsbruck.
Exactly. Welcome also from my side. It's a pleasure to have you all back here at lunchtime for our AURORA lecture series. And it's thanks, Silke, as always. And of course, it's a pleasure to have our very own Rina Alluri here. From our Peace Studies program at the University of Innsbruck, where she is an assistant professor since March last year. Rina has a very global biography, to say. She was born in Mumbai, in India, lived in Canada, before she moved a few years ago to Austria. In the meantime, she received a bachelor degree in political science from the University of British Columbia in Canada, a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands, and she holds a PhD in political science from the University of Basel in Switzerland. She has worked, amongst others, as interim head and program officer of the Business and Peace program at Swiss Peace in Bern in Switzerland. And the main focus of her research is on regions in Asia and Africa. And as I already said, she joined last year our unit for peace and conflict studies at the University of Innsbruck. It's a pleasure to have you, Rina. She's not only an expert in peace and conflict matters, but as you can see here, also when it comes to matters of diversity and inclusion. And so she brought with her this talk with the title Moving Towards New Territory, Perspectives on Diversity and Inclusion. Rina, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dirk and Silke, for this invitation. Hello, everyone into the abyss who is joining us here today. It's very nice to have you here with us. As was already mentioned, I'm going to be speaking today about diversity and inclusion and reflecting a little bit about what that looks like in higher education, but in some levels also how we see it and don't see it. So aspects of what is obvious when we talk about diversity and inclusion, but also what is perhaps not always so obvious. And just to say that this presentation is based on a book chapter that I'm co-authoring with a colleague, Dr. Henri-Michel Lieret, from the Sociology Department at the University of Basel. It's actually a book project which is in connection with the University of Pécs in Hungary on challenging higher education in the 21st century. So a little bit about the authors of this paper, and what does D&I actually mean to us? So first, the honor of presenting my co-author, who also couldn't be with us today, but he is aware that we're speaking about this today, is Henri-Michel Lieret. And I want to speak about diversity inclusion in connection to his identity and his positionality. He is a scholar who was born in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, to a Catholic father and a Muslim mother. He was partly raised in New York City and in Abidjan due to the type of work that his father was engaged with in the diplomatic corps. After his school years spent in Côte d'Ivoire, he did his undergraduate studies in France and in South Africa, and graduate studies, MA and PhD, in Switzerland. After his PhD, he took a job as Diversity Inclusion Associate Director at Novartis, a global multinational pharmaceutical company with headquarters based in Basel, Switzerland, for about 7 years. After his stint in the private sector, he came back to the university as a postdoc, working towards a habilitation in sociology. Henri-Michel is also a poet who has published 2 books of poetry, as well as poems and articles in various literary journals. Dirk was so kind to already introduce me to you, but there's a few other aspects which I would like to mention here in connection to my identity and positionality. As he mentioned, I was born in Mumbai, India, to a South Indian father and a Filipina mother. So also a cross-cultural, cross-religious marriage and family context. Due to my parents' professions, I was raised in an international agricultural community in Ibadan, Nigeria, in West Africa, but always returned to my parents' homeland each year for holidays. We then eventually migrated to Canada, and as Dirk already mentioned, my bachelor's in political science, master's in development studies, and PhD in political science. And I consider myself both an academic and practitioner. So I've always worked alongside my studies in academia, as Dirk also mentioned, in peace-building NGOs and in evaluation of organizations. And I'm also a yoga teacher, a very average short story writer, and a mama to 2 headstrong daughters. Now you might be wondering, why am I sharing this very personal information about myself and my author with you today in this very academic setting? And that is because for us, for myself and my co-author, diversity is a theory. It is a concept that is relevant for academic research, theoretical knowledge and practice, but it is also a lived experience. It's a lived experience that one is exposed to throughout their socialization, throughout their education, throughout their careers. And in terms of the 2 of us, it has very much shaped our access to certain academic opportunities, our ability or non-ability to explore particular research areas, as well as our level of engagement in the institutions and organizations in which we have resided in. As academics, we do not want to be reduced or essentialized by our socially constructed identities. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that this is the way in which we're perceived in the world. We have to acknowledge that we want actually our multiple and diverse facets to be seen as added value in terms of a higher quality or as high quality or engaged quality, and not as a lesser than perception, which sometimes is the case. So in this sense, as authors and as academics and practitioners, we need to be aware of who we are and how that is connected to how we are actually being perceived and treated in the spaces in which we engage in. So in this sense, we don't want to be seen actually as exceptions to the norm, as tokens, or as tick-the-box examples of diversity that exists, but rather as representations of the global reality. And the global reality is diverse, and I think it's our also aim to find ways to reflect on that diversity in higher education spaces. So I'm sure that previous speakers have spoken about definitions, and this is I will speak a little bit more about diversity and inclusion later, but I think just to kind of, front load it, when we're speaking about diversity, we're speaking about aspects of human difference, social identities, and social group difference. This includes, but is not limited to, race, ethnicity, creed, color, sex, gender identity, sexual identity, socioeconomic status, language, culture, national origin, religion, spirituality, age, disability, if you're a military or a veteran status, political perspective, and associational preferences. You see there's a long list here of what diversity can include, and there are many other which are perhaps not included as well. Essentially, the differences that are ascribed to an individual or a group of individuals. So although I can't see you, I would like to invite the audience to take a moment of pause. If it's useful for you, you can close your eyes and just reflect with me, or you can keep your eyes open and have a notebook handy. And I'm going to ask you a few questions of reflection that you can just sort of imagine in your mind. I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on your university education, or your career if you're also working in the university, your engagement with higher education as a student, but also perhaps a fellow or a staff. Your responses are, of course, relative and dependent on where you have studied and worked in the field, so just to put that also as a caveat. I'd like to invite you to identify in your mind or with your notebook, how many mentors, lecturers, professors have you had during your studies and career, which have been people from migration backgrounds or a different cultural background from the dominant culture in which you reside? I'm not sure, Christian might be able to put these in the chat, but I'll repeat it one more time. How many mentors, lecturers, professors have you had during your studies and career, which are people with migration backgrounds or different cultural backgrounds from the dominant culture in which you reside? Try to picture those people, what they look like, conversations you had with them. Now, taking those group of people that you have in your mind, of those mentors, lecturers, or professors that you've identified who have a different migration or cultural background, how many of them are self-identifying females or members of the LGBTQIA community? So of those mentors, professors, lecturers that you've had, who hold migration backgrounds or cultural backgrounds, how many of them are self-identifying females or from the LGBTQIA community? Again, try to think of them and identify them in your mind. Thirdly, how many of those female or LGBTQIA persons, mentors, lecturers, or professors that you have in your mind, who are also parents or who hold other dependents that you know of course? They need to care for elders or other persons in their family. of those people you may still have in your mind, of those self-identifying female or LGBTQIA mentors, lecturers, or professors with a migration or different cultural background, how many of them self-identify as being Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, that is, of BIPOC identity? And lastly, of those BIPOC self-identifying female or LGBTQIA plus mentors, lecturers, or professors with a migration or different cultural background, how many of them have a disability, a chronic illness, and are not able-bodied that you know of? Do you have any people left in your mind that you can identify? Depending on, again, where you've lived, studied, and worked, the answers to these questions vary greatly. Depending on how many people you were able to identify in this exercise, we can begin to think of some aspects of diversity and inclusion in higher education and the barriers that exist within them. The purpose of this exercise is to think about who holds power in higher education institutions and who does not hold power. Who are we learning from and who are we not learning from? Whose voices, experiences, and agencies are marginalized and silenced in our institutions? And whose diversity and inclusion are we truly working towards? If we take a step back and think, okay, well, what are we talking about when we're saying diversity and inclusion? And I think that each speaker comes with their own reflections of what that means in terms of a definition. So here I'd like to say, defining the two terms separately from one another first, seeing that diversity refers to the presence of differences within a given setting, or any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups and people from one another. Inclusion as being the active, intentional, and ongoing engagement with diversity. An organizational effort and practice in which different groups or individuals have different backgrounds, which are culturally and socially accepted, welcomed, and equally treated. So in this sense, what does diversity and inclusion, or D&I, aim to achieve? The goal of diversity and inclusion is to foster an environment in which all members of the community are treated equitably, contribute fully to the university's mission, and embrace and model the university's value. So what does that look like actually in practice? As a concept, D&I has found its way into boardrooms and corporate venues and higher educational institutions. These definitions tend to assume, make an implicit assumption that the attainment of the goal assigned to D&I rests on the individual commitment of the goals and each member within a given organization. This assumption reinforces a tendency to decontextualize and to decouple D&I from the historical reasons for its emergence in the first place. So then you ask, well, what are actually its historical reasons for its emergence in the first place? I'd like to reflect a little bit about some of the most significant political traditions that have enabled the emergence of the practice of D&I. Four political traditions that I'm going to be reflecting on today are decolonization theory, civil rights struggles, critical race theory, and intersectionality, and how these four theoretical groundings are in some ways also directly connected to diversity and inclusion aspects. So firstly, decolonization in its essence is a reclamation of citizenship rights in the first place. We see that independence from colonial powers that took place under colonial regimes in Asia and Africa and in the Americas started decolonization processes, shedding of colonial regimes, but also reflecting on trajectories going forward. In this sense, according to Mbembe, decolonization is not limited to a specific time period, but it is both an event and an ongoing process. An article on decolonizing African studies from Kessie Marks and Romagondo, 2020, they argue that decolonizing entails a political and normative ethic and practice of resistance and intentional undoing, unlearning, and dismantling unjust practices, assumptions, and institutions, as well as persistent positive action to create and build alternative spaces, networks, and ways of knowing that transcend our epicolonial inheritance. So in this way, we see that decolonization theory, in its reclamation of citizenship rights, can be very clearly connected to what also we understand as diversity and inclusion, in terms of the right to acknowledge who is citizen and non-citizen, but also even in the higher education space, who has certain rights of access to certain opportunities and abilities. The second one is related to the civil rights struggle, very specifically in the US context. The terminology of diversity and inclusion comes very strongly from the US context. And here we see that the civil rights struggles centered on the notion of the extension of citizenship rights within formally constituted democracies such as the USA. That includes the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, queer struggles, and other identity and rights-based movements. Specifically, within US legislation, you have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that came into place in 1964, where employers and unions were lawfully accountable to consider all possible applicants and are unable to discriminate on the basis of color, gender, race, religion, or national origin. This had influence on affirmative action laws and developments and the focus on quotas, particularly of women and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, in the 1980s. This contributed to what was then known as diversity management, also in the 1980s. And eventually in the 1990s, the idea of diversity initiatives in 70% of Fortune 500 companies, where the term diversity initiatives and diversity of management became commonplace with regards to rights within workplaces. Thirdly, you have critical race theory, or CRT, that was established by a group of predominantly legal scholars in the US in the 1990s. And here we see critical race theory is engaged with the recognition of citizenship rights by acknowledging that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. It is a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society and its institutions. It's about acknowledging the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship, predominantly on Black Americans and other people of color in the USA. And this has most recently come into the spotlight and into question in the US through legislation in the past year, where critical race theory has actually been banned from being taught in many schools and universities, as it is seen in some ways as a threat that could create conflict within the society. And fourthly, the theory of intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was one of the legal scholars who also established and developed critical race theory. And here we see, and which is very directly related to gender, and here we see that intersectionality argues for the specification of citizenship rights that are multiple and intersecting. And she questions, how can we go beyond piecemeal feminism that focuses mostly on representation in order to address how D&I needs to address other intersections such as race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ableism, some of the aspects that we discussed in our exercise, and how they apply to a given individual or group. She continues, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or an LGBTQ problem here. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things all of the time. There is a critical view on how intersectionality has developed, also within the discipline and theory, that in some ways similar to D&I, it is coming from a revolutionary time, but has become extremely watered down to include everyone, and in some cases no one, begging also the question of the relevance and how it can continue to play a role in those critical thoughts. So how can these political traditions help us understand diversity and inclusion today? They help to guide us to question the relationship between D&I and the access to power and privilege. The feminist scholar Mohanty, 2003, argues, diversity is a discourse of benign variation, which bypasses power as well as history to suggest a harmonious, empty pluralism. Sarah Ahmed, 2012, argues, how can diversity participate in the creation of an idea of the institution that allows racism and inequalities to be overlooked? So here we see two very critical scholars in the diversity inclusion field who on one side see the value of diversity inclusion and at the same time argue that as a concept and as a practice, it has been watered down to a point where we see it as something which is overly positive in some ways, not critical, not political, not actually questioning the social norms, but something that everybody has at one point agreed upon that this is what we all want. We all want diversity and inclusion. And at the same time, while this might appear benign, very often it comes in practice not to a challenging of the status quo, but to an underlying perception of that this can just be easily achieved and without necessarily dismantling previous structures, institutions, or mentalities that have guided, in the end, the way in which higher education institutions have been created in the first place. So if we think about diversity theory, it asks, how do we perceive, treat, and manage people's differences? It looks at demographic differences in the workforce, behavioral differences between and among cultural groups, and the intersection of such differences and connection to identity. So I'm going to speak a little bit now about that connection to identity politics. Within theories of identity politics, you often ask the question, who am I? How am I different? How should I act? And how am I being treated? This is very closely connected to my field of study of peace and conflict studies when we look at also, for example, ethnic and racially based conflicts that exist in the world, where we need to question how are identities being perceived and theorized. So there are several theories on identity politics, which I'm going to share now. The first one is that of essentialism. Essentialism on identity argues that the differences in identities between individuals are ancient, natural, stable, and fixed. That means that our differences stem from predominantly biological traits and characteristics, and they rely on fixed structural categorizations and positionings. In other words, we are born with our identities and we cannot change them. Some of the critiques of the essentialism perspective is that it's a reductionist theory that serves the interest of the powerful and privileged, who are very often the dominant culture or the dominant race or the dominant class. This tends to reduce people to their biology, not taking their socialization into account, and it assumes that identities are singular and not multiple, and that they are fixed and not changeable according to circumstances. A second theory on identity is instrumentalism. This camp argues that identity is neither inherent in human nature nor intrinsically valuable. That actually identity is just a mask of deeper cores of interests, which are either economic or political. In this way, identity is used for gaining political power or for drawing resources from the state. So a critique of this perspective would be, if we look historically at how identities have been used to create mass force or mass violence against other identities, one could ask, do the masses really follow leaders only because of political interests? What about because of collective group identity and how that is also socialized and formed? The third camp, which I will focus on predominantly today, is constructivism. This is the field that looks at identity formation and how it is linked to aspects of power, privilege, and nationalism. It argues that our identities are constructs of modern epoch that have been linked to the the pre-nation state development, but also it looks historically how many of our mass identities that were locally or regionally based continue today. And even other identities such as aristocratic, or ecclesiastical, having difficulty with those two words today, were extra local or extra regional. In this sense, modernity and the creation of the nation state transformed the meaning of identities by bringing the masses into a vastly expanded framework of consciousness and meanings. Passports, citizenship, concepts of citizenship and nationhood, for example. And here you have three main mechanisms, which is often accompanied by constructivism arguments, which is technological, ideational, and colonial policies and institutions and practices. For example, the ways in which divide and rule happen in many of the empire of colonial Britain on its territories by dividing some ethnic identities from the other in order to ensure that they could rule over those two groups or multiple groups. So here I'm taking a predominantly constructivist perspective, and that is the perspective that our identities are social constructs. They can be multiple, they can change, they're influenced by our social, economic, and political contexts, and they are not endogenous or slowly based on our biology. So perhaps you're asking the question, what do these theories on identity have to do with diversity in higher education? We spoke briefly earlier about the questions such as, who am I? How am I different? How should I act? How am I being treated? I'm going to link those questions to now discourses on diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion, which often think about difference as a key component to understanding how to also deal with those differences. So the questions then become, who am I and who am I not? How am I different and from whom? How should I act differently than others? How am I being treated differently from others? So we see that it's not just an existential question of who am I, but also who am I in relation to others and in the organizations and institutions that I deal with. how am I perceived as different? And how, based on the perception of that difference, am I being treated also differently? So if we go back to the political traditions that we spoke about, decolonization, civil rights struggles, critical race theory, and intersectionality, we can start to ask the question about whether diversity and inclusion, you don't see the title. It says, is diversity and inclusion still, in brackets, political? So how can we connect the political traditions of its heritage? The heritage of D&I is from a political tradition. It's from a critical tradition. It's from a tradition that has reflected on differences of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality. How can we bring that back in our understanding of D&I so it doesn't get watered down? In other words, to what extent do we need to go beyond the visual Benetton model, excuse the pop culture reference, of diversity branding towards returning to a commitment to change that includes challenging social inequalities? And this leads me to my final slide, which questions, is diversity and inclusion a transformative and emancipatory concept or framework? When D&I is connected to these different political and social traditions, it takes a value that makes claim over citizenship and participation that organizations and companies and institutions are not always ready to meet. To what extent have these different movements and traditions affected our understanding of knowledge production? If we also think about who we learn from and who we don't learn from. And to what extent do we need to include the concept of E, that is equity, in our understanding for DEI moving forward? And maybe just one final parting thought before we go into our discussion is, what is our role as students, scholars, and practitioners of D&I in higher education to question and challenge the ways in which D&I continues to engage research, practice, and lived experiences through the reinforcement and perpetuation of both visibility and invisibility? How can we begin to tackle how D&I has gone down a trajectory of, on one side, perpetuating invisibility and visibility, and on the other side, meaning to challenge it in its approach? Over to you, Dirk and Silke. And Christian, you can close the PowerPoint, please.
Or maybe leave it open, because I think it might be quite useful for the discussion to go back, because if I may, thank you, Rina. I think this is was a perfect contribution at this within the choreography of the lecture series, because you had a highly reflective focus on concept of terminology. And after 2 or 3 sessions where we had sort of example-based applications of diversity studies, I mean, we had Barbara Bilia as a policy maker, researcher and policy maker, but also the legal clinic as an example of how to do diversity. It is really useful to go back to these concepts and go back to these terminologies of diversity, of inclusion, and ask us what do we do with this? What do they actually bring to the debate? And at many points I was reminded of the last weeks, because when you remember, Barbara Bilia told us or reminded us that terms like inclusion, acceptance, welcome, tolerance actually can also need to be reflected upon critically, because they assume a hierarchy of difference between a majority, the point where I where do I include? Where is the center? I always include towards the center. And talking about inclusion kind of puts me into the center as an agent. And that goes for acceptance, that goes for welcome, that goes for inclusion, for tolerance. And how can we think about a diversity model that does not assume this center and periphery? And she ended on the task that there's no need in sort of water down these concepps, but rather really focus on what you also said here, that when we relate them, when we rest them on individual commitment, I think that was your phrase. If some definitions of diversity and inclusion tend to rest on individual commitments, but doing that actually hides or makes invisible the political and the social structures behind it. So we should not have small projects of including this group or the other group or this group over the other group. There's a hierarchy involved in this, but our main task is and remains a transformation of the system. And I think this is what you referred to towards the end. We need to repoliticize diversity. Yeah, not make it a project-based. How do you say this? I don't want to call it a Lippenbekenntnis, because I think that wouldn't be fair. But I think we always need to keep in mind that there needs to be a transformation of the system behind this. Otherwise, diversity and inclusion is a, what did you say, a Benetton branding project. I remember in my introduction, I stumbled across this rather fitting quote. I think it was Werner Meyer's, and it's been played with quite a bit, that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and belonging or equity is to contribute to the playlist, and also to feel free to ask anybody to dance who you want to dance with. Yeah, so there's and I think that shows a nice take on these concepts with the idea of hierarchy and agency in mind. But now I've talked.
Thanks for that metaphorical.
Perhaps there are some questions in the chat, or Dirk will also react to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, in the meantime, while the audience is still thinking about good questions or comments, thanks a lot for this very interesting talk. I mean, it touches on so many different aspects, and Silke mentioned a few of them. One is, of course, that we as academics at the universities, we are not only practitioners of diversity, right, but we also have to reflect it theoretically, right? I mean, that's but that might be a difference if it comes to another setting, like, I don't know, just a company, right? I mean, they just need to practice it somehow, but do not to reflect it theoretically, right? So we are in a more complicated situation, especially when we are in positions of power, so to say, at universities, and at the same time scholars in fields where we also reflect about, terms and concepts and the history of diversity and so on. So that's a very interesting, very specific situation in higher education field, of course. And as Silke already said, right? I mean, it's a little bit like Barbara last time pointed to the fact that all these concepts are problematic somehow, right? They're always tolerance, whatever. They all have a problematic aspect because there's still a norm behind it, or majority, or whatever, dominant culture. But you said a few slides earlier, I think you said, and I think that makes it even more complicated, right? You said that or this is at least what I understood, that D&I is what everybody can agree on and what is easy to reach, right? So that it's like a Lippenbekenntnis, as Silke said, right? It's like a screen, but behind nothing changes in the system. But at the same time, of course, we can see that it's even not so easy to agree on that, right? Even in institutions like the university. I mean, not everybody would agree on that D&I is important. And that this is, I mean, of course, many would agree now, but not everybody would agree on it. The same in our society, right? So even that is not easy to reach, right? This agreement on D&I as a practice or a common aim for everybody or for the whole institution. So I think that makes it even slightly more complicated. So I'm not even sure if D&I is totally depoliticized, as you said, right? Of course, you could ask, yeah, I mean, usually we use this Benetton term for it, right? So this is that's the easy ways for companies to use diversity. But is it really depoliticized also in institutions like higher education institutions in Austria, for example, or in other European countries? Or is there not even on that, and you could say even on that superficial level, I mean, far beyond or far away from really changing the system or the whole game, is that not even on that superficial level somehow still a politicized matter? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's a few areas there to unpack, which I find really useful. And I think the first, when you refer to sort of the corporate spaces of
Right.
D&I, which actually even connects a little bit to what I see in the chat of the first question in terms of what is the difference between treating and managing diversity. So, I mean, what we've seen in the corporate evolution, as you said, it's very much the practice, right? Like putting in a D&I person, a department, and it's very often related to human resources issues, how you recruit and how you basically have more of a diverse staff. And I think that that's one very important aspect. And you brought up that in the university, of course, we have the added aspect that we need to theorize what D&I actually is, theoretically, reflectively, analytically, what are its traditions from the academic perspective. And I think that's where you see this incompatibility, where actually very often at the corporate space, they're already doing without maybe necessarily having the space, time, format of engaging, well, what does D&I actually mean to us in this context of our company? And on the opposite side, I think in the academia, from a critical perspective, you could say that we are reflecting, but we are not actually doing. So we have diversity and inclusion as a topic, as a thematic area of exploration to engage with in terms of research, but that does not necessarily trickle down to the practice in terms of, as I ask the questions, who are we actually learning from, who are in the positions of power when it comes to higher education. So I think that exact incompatibility of these two sectors is very vivid and shows us how the concept has been on one side taken in by different actors and being used, but the way in which it's being taken in and being used is not always on the same levels. And I think that has to do with what you say in terms of, has it been depoliticized, or isn't it even still political because people still have this like resistance to it? And so I think that, of course, you know, depending on what the term means to a person and how it connects to you know, sensitive issues of identity, it is still political. But I think, you know, if we would say right now in a higher educational institution, we want to talk about critical race theory in our university and what critical race theory looks like in the university, most institutions and universities would be like, whoa, 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 like we're not going to tackle that topic. That's just not possible. That's overtly political. It's very sensitive, and we're not going to go there. And if we think of the fact that diversity and inclusion has come from that political tradition, then in a way it has already been depoliticized by the fact that we can speak about it in this open way that we can even today and in these spaces. So I think that I agree with you that there's still a perception that people may feel resistance to engage with it, because of course they may be aware, hey, when we speak about diversity, it's also about, you know, balances of power and redistributing power to others which may not have, and that means shedding also our own powers for others. So it is sensitive in that sense in terms of identity, and at the same time it does allow us in a way to pay lip service, because we're able to speak about, let's talk about diversity, whereas we wouldn't be able to say, let's talk about critical race theory in the same way, I think. And I think there's also a question in the chat related to that. I don't know how you want to go through them, Silke and Dirk.
Yeah, shall we move to the questions in the chat, because I think they're
I think we need to read them out, but I think
Right.
there was a question about this repoliticizing diversity. I think, you know, you just talked about this, and there was also a question about the difference between treating and managing diversity. I think that was from the slide, how do you perceive, treat, and manage diversity? Maybe that's also kind of covered in your answer there, or do you want to add something? To this?
Yeah, just maybe very short, just to say that I think when you talk about managing diversity, this is very often related to the practice. So in an institution, what kind of policies you put in place, how you change, for example, hiring practices or learning practices or pedagogical practices. So it's about policy and practice within institutions, whereas the treating is really, how do you treat your fellow peers, students, colleagues, and whatnot that actually come from diverse backgrounds? So there is that policy aspect, but also the very quotidian respect and empathy for others that may come from backgrounds that are not from the dominant.
Mm. Maybe also related to that part is the question, what is the Benetton example? Maybe that's an age thing that not everybody is familiar with the Benetton example. Could you say a few words on that?
Sure, I debated putting that in, but I think it is a nice visual. I mean, essentially in the 90s, but even now, Benetton, the company, the clothing company, the Italian clothing company, embarked on basically a campaign of showing the united colors of Benetton, such as the united colors of diversity, in a sense. So all of their campaigns that you can trace back to the 90s always have diverse models, also just colors in terms of their textures and clothing, but very often very diverse models being connected to one another, very different races, ethnicities, gender representation being shown visually. And they were one of the, I would say, first kind of textiles companies in the 90s who really embarked on a direct engagement with that to say, we are diverse and we are also appealing to a diverse population in terms of our clients. But of course, my critique is that that's then just visual, whether that actually trickles down to policy and practice in terms of even how Benetton recruits themselves in terms of staff, hiring, business practices, would be a question for debate.
Shall we take the other question about the peace studies, peace and conflict studies, what actually that field is? And maybe it's especially interesting to talk a little bit more how or what diversity brings to the field of peace and conflict studies from your perspective.
Yes, of course. So there is essentially a master's program at the University of Zurich, University of Innsbruck, where we are now, on peace and conflict studies. And this is a master's that existed for about 20 years. And it is linked to the fields of, it's a very interdisciplinary field of studies, linked to, of course, political science, sociology, but also cultural and social anthropology, history, and whatnot. And essentially it looks at contexts in the world, for example, that are affected by conflict, so very directly acts of violence that exist in the world related to war, civil war, also as we speak about today, ethnic, racially based conflicts that exist in the world. But it also reflects on contexts and conflicts that happen also here at home. So conflicts that exist within global north societies and whatnot, between individuals, interpersonal conflicts, and how you can also find solutions or transformations of those conflicts. So that is a master's program that exists within the University of Innsbruck. And I think when we speak about diversity and inclusion here, it's an incredibly international master's, which is also quite unique to the University of Innsbruck, in the sense that our student body is incredibly diverse in terms of culture, nation, religion, gender, beliefs, values, structures. And so I think that also as a field of study, peace and conflict studies, let's say, because it is a field that has developed globally and engages with conflicts and contexts in the world, it feels de facto diverse. But even there, I think that there is also critique. If I think about most of the peace and conflict theorists, for example, that we are all having to read in our first year of studying it, for example, we still fall into the same trap that the predominant voices that we read are coming from the global north, are predominantly white cisgender males. And so even there, you may have a very diverse student body, but we need to still, even in that international field, think about what diversity and inclusion means in terms of who is studying and learning, but also who is carrying the discourse and practice forward.
Shall we move on to the next question on the chat?
Yeah, and I will upload a presentation showing also the Benetton example and the link to the MA.
Okay, that makes sense. So the next question here in the chat is, oh, now I cannot see it anymore. Yeah, I mean, it refers to the reflecting questions you asked in the beginning. How do you see the difference between the University of Innsbruck and other universities? Maybe other universities you've seen yourself by studying there, or whatever, and referring to profs and mentors holding lectures where the more people of BIPOC or LGBTQI plus community than in Innsbruck. Which brings up, of course, this question, which is an ongoing question here, of course, in our AURORA lecture series. We are always somehow comparing at least the different European settings here when it comes to diversity, of course, right? I mean, including countries like Austria, UK, Italy, Netherlands, Iceland, and so on, and all the different countries, of course, is a different understanding of diversity, different practices, and I'm sure different realities of diversity also at the higher education institutions, right?
Yes, I think it's a very important question. And again, if we go back to the questions that I asked you in terms of who you've learned from and the diversity of your mentors or professors, I think that's really relevant, because I think that it's not just because we're in Austria that you may not have had access to as diverse professors and mentors. As was previously mentioned, I mean, I did my bachelor's in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, which is an incredibly diverse city on very different levels of diversity. And yet at the same time, I think it also relates to what you do study. So I don't want to say that higher education broadly, misses that implementation of diversity in terms of also staff and mentorship and professors. I think it does connect to what you choose to study in terms of how diverse faculties and departments and areas of study have become. But I can say that studying political science, even though we were looking outwards to the world, looking at contexts such as the Rwandan genocide, Srebrenica, Sri Lankan civil war, what was very often in the classroom in terms of who we were reading and who was teaching us was still very often related to a dominant voice and a dominant representation. So even in a very diverse society, we still fall into some of those traps. I can say that the Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands is quite an exception within the Netherlands also in terms of its internationalization. So there's, a long history of development studies, which has centered not just students from developing countries or the Global South, but also professors and mentors from the Global South who've also come back after being students. So there I would say was an area where you see less of those hierarchies and whatnot. But I think it really depends also on what you're studying in that regard. I think that answered your question, Dirk, but I think it is, let's say, one of the sources that I gave was Sara Ahmed, who is a scholar based in the UK, who has looked at diversity in higher educational institutions in the UK and in Australia. They're two as New World countries. They are very diverse countries in terms of the types of migration that they have received. The student bodies of universities are very diverse, but still you see at the institutional level, the higher you go up on the echelon, we fall into very often the same traps. So I think that it's also still globally comparative to discuss these issues in that way. You're on mute, Dirk.
Sorry. So Silke gave us the Benetton ad, is that correct? But now there's there it is.
Yes.
One of the many from the.
Yeah, I think it's just something. I mean, when you see it, you immediately get it. You can explain it ever so often, but when you see this, and I mean, as you said, Rina, this was in the 90s, so this was kind of new and shocking and very colorful in many ways. So I think this just gives you just the right example. There can be a lot said about this, stereotyping, etc. But the way you framed it, I think it was very useful to show it. And also, that's the address. If anybody wants to know more about peace studies at the University of Innsbruck, they can find information here.
But now we even have another model, which is the Panda model, and I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that one. Also the Panda model that comes up in the next question. How can one go there, speak about it without jeopardizing one's academic career? So that might bring up again this question of, how can we talk about that, theorizing about it at universities in our positions, or how, dangerous is it to do this also, which brings maybe back a little bit the question of how political is it also to talk about D&I and these questions. So you should suggest using D&I as a buffer for intersectionality and CRT. And there is again the question here, why did you choose the constructivist model over the others that you've presented us?
Yes, thank you for that question. I chose the constructivist perspective because that is my position on the identity politics debates. I argue that our identities are actually social constructs, and I think that that's an important point. I believe that theoretically race is a social construct. That is, it does not exist. Perhaps it's in biological form that we have been taught to believe. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? I think that sometimes we fall into this academic trap that you say, well, if it's a social construct, it doesn't really exist. So why do we talk about it all the time? And I think that also connects to the other part of the question is because, well, race has been used as a tool for discrimination and violence historically. So because it has been used as a tool for violence and discrimination historically, we need to acknowledge that it exists because it affects each and every one of us in our daily life. So to say that it's a social construct but we don't need to deal with it actually erases exactly the way that it's been used for violence and discrimination historically. So we need to acknowledge that it is a social construct, but it does exist and it affects our societies intricately, both historically and also in terms of the way that we see ourselves going forward. And in terms of, how you use D&I as a buffer for intersectionality and critical race theory, I think this is a really important question. I mean, if you have the US case where critical race theory is literally being banned by legislation in schools and in even some colleges, you're not allowed to teach it. End of discussion. So I think it's important to be aware of how sensitive these issues really are. And again, there it's not about necessarily sugarcoating it or band-aiding it, but it's acknowledging the fact that it is actually very sensitive. It does bring up political, social, and emotional reactions and resistance to it. And so I think, with all political engagement, one needs to acknowledge that it is political, but of course find your frames of reference that make sense depending on the context that you're in. I'm not saying go to your company tomorrow and be like, listen, the DEI representative now needs to be a critical race theorist. No, I mean, you need to find also the way in which the diversity inclusion concept has been developed in the different cases that we are, but also find language, like in everything in academia, that enables also change. So it's not so much about what you say, are we talking about critical race theory, or are we talking about diversity, but actually how that diversity inclusion is being engaged with, reflected on, treated in terms of persons and personhood, but also in terms of policy change and transformation. So what is the impact that it's actually able to have?
I don't see any other questions in the chat, at least, or no.
Apart from the Panda model.
No. Yeah, the Panda model, that's still...
which we haven't clarified yet.
And it's, yeah. Do you know what it is, Rina?
I'm not sure actually what
I don't know.
I'm not sure actually what the question is referring to. I'm aware of some derogatory connotations related to the Panda model related to East Asia, but I'm not sure in terms of the reference here.
So are there any other questions from the audience? I mean, in the end, it leaves us with a complicated question, of course. I mean, what does it really mean for our practice at the university, right, and in higher education institutions? Again, between doing diversity in terms of practice and at the same time researching it, thinking about it, theorizing it, and also teaching it, right? So what... Can you come up with a conclusion regarding that? So where to go from here, so to say?
Yes, I mean, I think that for me, and I'll go back actually to that reference even to myself and my co-author. I think that this is really, for me, the important element, that diversity inclusion has become a bit of a buzzword that has been taken up by different types of sectors and institutions, whether it's the corporate sector or also the higher education institutions and universities. It's been taken up and embraced in some levels, as you critically said, Dirk. Well, not always. It's not always being embraced. It's also very much questioned. But in some cases, it's been taken up and embraced and even put forth as a way forward without the reflection of what it actually means. And I see this also in engagement that I have with organizations that are talking about what diversity and inclusion mean for them. I think what is very often the most difficult starting point is exactly that definition aspect that you refer to, Silke. What are we actually talking about from our foundational moment in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of diversity and inclusion, whether we are a family or a company or an academic institution. So what does DEI raise in us in terms of how we want to move forward? And I think there is some aspect of, theory and analysis which is necessary. Because if we're putting forward policies without knowing what we're talking about, then we're again kind of jumping over, putting the wagon before the horse, so to speak. And I think, as higher education institutions, there needs to be that connect, right? There needs to be that connect of, okay, we have research on what this is. It exists. We know that it comes from political traditions, that even the term may stem also very strongly from the USA context. What does that term actually mean for the context in which we're living in? What are other concepts which are more useful for the context in which we're living in, that actually applies to the history of discrimination and violence that exists here? And I think that's a very important aspect, that sometimes we have these American-based concepts and we bring them to Europe and we think, yeah, but it's not applicable here because we didn't have the same history. And I think there is some acknowledgement that needs to happen in terms of, well, what does that mean for our history? The way in which our institutions were created and the ways in which policies continue to exist, which may cause discrimination for certain groups of people. So I think that combination is important. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to become a DEI scholar by tomorrow, but knowing that if we're talking about policy, there needs to first be a conversation about, okay, but what does it mean for us? What are the goals for us as an institution? And later, how can that be put into place in terms of policy and practice? But I think there, what's often very much missing is this, or this risk of D&I is this tokenization, right? That I referred to in terms of myself and my co-author. It's not enough to have, like you said, to pay lip service or just to have kind of quotas, like I referred to in the 80s in the US. It's not enough to have quotas, because then you're putting someone in without questioning what is actually the role of that person. How is that person bringing us forward? And I think there you fall into the trap of tokenism, where you may have a Benetton model situation where things appear diverse, but actually there's still the remaining limitations of access, climbing the academic ladder, and social inequalities which exist between those people. So they're not actually standing in front of each other at the same level. They're still within the hierarchy of the social inequalities that exist. So, I mean, there is no bow I can give you in that answer, but I think it is a question of combining the reflection of what it is, how we can implement it policy-wise, but what does that also just mean on a very daily basis in terms of how can I engage with my colleague, which does connect to perhaps those words which are empty, like empathy and welcomeness and engagement, and whose voice you're putting at the center. So there is that risk, but still being open to that and saying, if my colleague comes in who has filled a quota, how am I going to engage with that colleague and ensure that we can both find ways to be on the same level? And of course, that's connected to the different layers of students, of colleagues within higher education systems, but also decision-making processes. How can we actually see those persons as adding value and quality, and not as reducing the value and quality that has existed until now?
And I think what's very useful for that approach on the level of policy, of the level of politics, and on research, is to split up the concept of identity, as you did in your very beginning with your own example, that we talk about identity easily. I think it would be useful to take one step back and maybe talk about social positions, and maybe a variety of positions and positioning makes up an identity, and there's a plurality in this, because you referred to a lot of information about yourself, and also in the questions that you asked us, this is not about being a woman, a man, etc., but it is the combination and the different social tasks and issues and positions that a person takes upon. So it's also being a parent. It's also it's all sorts of different aspects. Being a carer, also different aspects that make up identity, and that helps us to conceptualize the idea of identity less static and also less coherent. So there is no sort of one concept where everybody has to tick all the boxes, but you may tick some, but others you don't. And we have
There's
have a little bit of
Panda Model
information on the Panda.
Right.
Thank you for the person who commented on this, referring to Panda by the infamous philosopher Slavoj Žižek as a poorly constructed criticism towards globalized diversity. But the commentator much prefers Rina's well laid out constructivist approach and will considering it in his or her thesis. Thank you.
And there's also the Star Trek model, as we learn, as an utopian view on diversity. But since you talked about quality at the very end, Rina, so, it brings us somehow back to our very first session. Also what you said about, corporate, the Bennett model, corporate approaches to diversity, seeing it as an added value to a business. And the other model, more the social justice model, just as an idea of representing all groups in the society in an institution or company. And I think we called it the Berkeley model at the beginning because they were thinking about it in Berkeley, lately about the question, what does diversity mean in connection with quality at the higher education institutions, right? And we had also these discussions with Barbara Burenau and so on, right? So because it's all about quality, right? Or we could say excellence at higher education institutions, and what's the specific link, also in your view, Rina, between diversity, inclusion, and quality, or whatever excellence may be, as the most important category at a higher education institution? Is it, as they would say in Berkeley now, there is no quality without diversity? Is that the connection against the idea that is, I think, around in many places, that diversity diminishes quality, right?
Yes, I think that's a really important question. Just one tiny note on Star Trek, because I'm a Trekkie. Even in Star Trek in the 70s and 80s, who was the captain? It's only now in 2021 that we had with Star Trek Discovery the captain of Michael Burnham, a black woman as the captain of the Discovery ship. So just to note that diversity existed, but still the captain of the ship was still always a white male from the global north who was making the decisions. And I think even when it comes to stereotypes and discourses of femaleness, I think without even questioning the aspect of that character also being a black woman, I don't think any other captains were ever put into the limelight to justify their emotional decisions like has been done on that show when now the captain is a black woman. So all of a sudden this characterization of this leader is that she is constantly grappling between her rational mind and her emotional mind. And this kind of justification was never needed by Captain Kirk, by example. He just made decisions and everybody followed. So just to put that in there. When it comes to diversity and quality, I think it's a really important aspect, which again connects us to power and power imbalance. So I think that the stages of implementing, for example, quotas, I mean, we can also see it in South Africa in terms of post-apartheid with affirmative action campaigns to raise also representation of Black people in political, economic, and social strata positions, is that the first phase is, of course, very painful, right, for all people, in terms of putting a quota system in place, having to recruit persons who were not part of those spaces historically, but also making space for them. So if there's a space being opened up for someone, that means that someone else needs to make space for them. And in that sense, it's really no easy feat, because it is a question not just of enabling space for new persons to have power, but it is about sharing actually that power, and people need to step down in other spaces to make place for new persons. And I think when we speak about that quality, so the discourse is that you're bringing in persons with lower education, lower experience, not up to par quality as has been until now in terms of the status quo. And I think that we need to be very aware that that discourse again connects to, yeah, but who had access until now? So just to say very concretely, if we're talking about, the University of Berkeley, and you're bringing in a new head of critical race theory professor, who until now there was no space for either women or BIPOC in that position, and all of a sudden you say, yeah, but that person is not having connections to Berkeley alumni, they're not having connections to the president of the USA like our previous person did, and things like this. I think that that's really important to acknowledge, yes, because they were not playing in the same field until now. So they were able to fulfill certain requirements, but they had been playing a different game until now. And so it needs, in order to ensure that quality, it does actually mean everybody investing in leveling the playing field. That means acknowledging, yes, that person did not have access to the president of the United States historically because of the ways in which class and social strata exists. And that does not reduce that quality, but it does require everybody engaging with leveling that playing field. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that there is a shift and a change, and it's not the same. And it also cannot be, because those spaces were not open to, for example, vulnerable or marginalized groups or particular races and ethnicity until then. So there was no way that they could actually be engaging at the same quality, or let's say level of engagement, as has been historically done so before, because they did not have powered access to those spaces. So we all actually need to invest in that, in terms of leveling that playing field, and also ensuring that we're not putting the same expectations on those persons to be exactly the same as what was before, because then you're just changing the crown, but the reality is the same. And I think that that's also not the point. It's again about acknowledging that their difference brings quality and not the reverse.
Silke?
Well said.
Is that something like a final word? Sounds like it.
No, I don't think. Well, I don't want to add anything on top of that. Thank you so much, Rina, for really going back into the depth of the concept and analyze it reflectively, critically, but also with an eye for applying it. I mean, that's what we're doing in this lecture series, aren't we? So I would like to thank you all for listening. And maybe draw your attention to next week, where Marijke Slootman will be with us, and she will be talking about diversity and inclusion in the Netherlands, also adding the very topical aspect of inclusive education in online and offline classrooms. I think that's a new aspect, and I'm looking forward to hearing her perspectives. But for today, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you, Rina, for sharing your thoughts with us. That was a great lecture, and see you next week.
Thank you to both of you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks for everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
See you.